Our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, connects in a fundamental way to the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose nonviolent works toward meeting such a goal are legendary.
Let those who live in every land declare that fear and war are done, joined by the labor of their hands, in love and understanding one.
What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. James 2.
Dr. Arthur Feinsod is Professor Emeritus from Indiana State University. As a playwright, his plays include Table 17, for which he received the NAACP President's Award for Social Action, Coming to See Aunt Sophie, performed at Crossroads Repertory Theater, the local Unitarian Universalist congregation, and the Sisters of Providence in 2014. And Sword Against the Sea, presented at Crossroads Repertory Theater before touring Ireland and being published by Samuel French. He has been a recipient of multiple teaching, research, and creativity awards, first at Trinity College and later at Indiana State University. Through the local Interfaith Council, he has given many talks on topics of faith, including full seminars about faith thinkers for the Sisters of Providence. Today's talk is derived from one of those seminars. That is the seminar that concerned the late Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Feinsod considers it a privilege to speak about King for the holiday that honors his life and work.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I will be talking today about Martin Luther King Jr., the great civil rights visionary, whose years are 1929 to 1968, and I'll focus on Letter from a Birmingham Jail. However, I do want to give a brief chronology of King's life, just to give you a context for this remarkable piece of writing. King was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, and was ordained to the Baptist ministry in 1948. At that time, he heard about Gandhi at the Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and began a serious study of Gandhi and his idea specifically of satyagraha, or nonviolent resistance. This idea would stay with him and grow within him for the rest of his career. Just to give you a little bit of an historical context, 1954 was the Supreme Court ruling Brown versus the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. This was a watershed event in the civil rights movement, as was another event that happened a year later. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. She was arrested, and that sparked King to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted over a year and would make him a national, and one could even argue an international figure of civil rights fame. In 1956, a bomb was thrown onto the porch of Dr. King's home. Thankfully, no one was injured, but it was a kind of a wake-up call that his stand was taking great personal risks, which he overcame for the cause, which is almost a definition of courage. In 1956, on June 4th, the U.S. District Court ruled that racial segregation on city bus lines was unconstitutional. And by December 21st of that same year, the Montgomery buses were integrated. The boycott led to a clear political victory for the civil rights movement and King as a national hero. In 1957, King founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, with himself as the first president, which of course he mentions that organization in the letter from Birmingham jail. This organization would become a leader in the civil rights movement through the late 50s and throughout the 60s. In 1958, King survived a knife to his chest by a deranged woman while he was autographing copies of one of his books in Harlem. The knife would have killed him if he had but sneezed, said the doctor. Fortunately, he did not, and he survived this terrible attack. But once again, his life was in danger, being a public figure and being kind of on the main spotlight of history. In 1959, King carried through with his love of Gandhi and Gandhi's ideas when he visited India for a month and a half as the guest of India's Prime Minister Nehru, a disciple of Gandhi himself. This strengthened and deepened King's interest in Gandhi's thought, particularly his ideas of universal love, nonviolent resistance against immoral laws and ordinances, particularly against the lowest class, the so-called untouchables of India. Gandhi made great strides in eliminating the class system in India, actually adopted a daughter from the untouchable class as an act of not only love, personal love, but an act of political stance against the caste system in India. This was a great inspiration for Martin Luther King Jr. In March and April of 1963 was a very important time, which will really give the specific context of a letter from a Birmingham jail, since it was the time of so-called Project C, C standing for confrontation. This was to take a direct hit against the segregation in Birmingham as an act of hitting at the heart of segregation in the South and potentially destroying it in the name of integration and love between races and between all humankind. In May 1963, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Birmingham segregation ordinances were unconstitutional, again being a victory for the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. And in late August of that same year, King stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial and delivered his historic "I Have a Dream" speech, calling for an end to racism and a new brotherhood and friendship across lines of race and religion. In December of 1964, King becomes the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize and received this great honor in Oslo, Norway. His acceptance speech is one of his famous speeches that has now come down in history as one of the great speeches in American letters. March 21st through the 25th of 1965, King led over 3,000 protest marchers who left Selma heading to Montgomery, Alabama, protected by federal troops. They were joined by 25,000 additional marchers along the way. At the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery, King delivered another of his famous speeches. August 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Johnson with King in attendance. Johnson turned and gave Martin Luther King Jr. the pen he used to sign it into law. On April 3rd, 1968, King delivered one of his famous speeches, "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech, which was unfortunately and sadly his last. It was delivered in Memphis just before his assassination, which occurred the very next day. King was killed by an assassin's bullet on the balcony of a Memphis motel. In November 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed into law making the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday a national holiday. However, it needed to be ratified by the states. Once it was ratified by the majority of the states, it became an act of law. So in 1986, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday was first observed as a national holiday in the United States as the third Monday in January from there forward. Though his actual birthday was January 15th, it would be celebrated on that third Monday, regardless of if it fell on his specific birthday of January 15th. Okay, the context of the letter from Birmingham jail is a fascinating one. King, Ralph Abernathy, and Reverend Fred Shuttleworth conceived Project C, or Confrontation, in March 1983 to deliver a death blow to segregation in the South by taking the knife, so-called, the metaphorical knife, against the segregation laws in Birmingham, Alabama. There was a list of planned protest activities, and they began on April 3rd, 1963, with marches and sit-ins in segregated eating establishments. It was coordinated by two organizations, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights and King's own SCLC, based in Atlanta. On April 10th, the Circuit Judge Jenkins of Montgomery issued a blanket injunction against, quote, parading, demonstrating, boycotting, trespassing, and picketing, unquote. Leaders of the campaign announced they would disobey this injunction. And on March 11th, King came out with his own statement against that injunction. And it reads as follows. This is King's writing on April 11th, 1963, quote, "We cannot in all good conscience obey such an injunction, which is an unjust, undemocratic, and unconstitutional misuse of the legal process. We do this not out of disrespect for the law, but out of the highest respect for the law. This is not an attempt to evade or defy the law or engage in chaotic activity. Just as in all good conscience, we cannot obey unjust laws, neither can we respect the unjust use of the courts. We believe in a system of law based on justice and morality. Out of our great love for the Constitution of the U.S. and our desire to purify the judicial system of the state of Alabama, we risk this critical move with an awareness of the possible consequences involved," unquote. And of course, the consequences were mass incarcerations of protesters. King was aware that he needed to be arrested with his followers, along with Abernathy, along with Shuttleworth, and was planning to do so. However, there was a potential reverse news that came when he found out that the bondsman who was supporting the bail of jailed demonstrators was told that he did not have the financial assets to bail out the protesters. So there was a big choice that King had to face. He knew that he was the only one that could potentially raise the money for bail for not only his followers, but also for himself, for Abernathy, and for Shuttleworth. So should he not go to jail and instead go on the trail of raising money to support bail, or should he follow through with his initial objective and go to jail with his followers? This story of his coming to the decision to get jailed rather than to allow rather than to raise money was described very vividly in his autobiography. What happened was this is in Martin Luther King Jr.'s words in his autobiography. I sat in the midst of the deepest quiet I've ever felt, with 24 others in the room. There comes a time in the atmosphere of leadership when a man surrounded by loyal friends and allies realizes he has come face to face with himself and with ruthless reality. I was alone in that crowded room. I walked to another room in the back of the suite, and I stood in the center of the floor. I thought I was standing at the center of all that my life had brought me to. I thought of the 24 people waiting in the next room. I thought of the 300 waiting in prison. I thought of the Birmingham Negro community waiting. Then my tortured mind leaped beyond the Gaston Motel, past the city jail, past the city and state lines, and I thought of the 20 million Black people who dreamed that someday they might be able to cross the Red Sea of injustice and find their way into the promised land of integration and freedom. There was no more room for doubt. I whispered to myself, I must go. The doubt, the fear, the hesitation was gone. I pulled off my shirt and pants, got into work clothes, and went back to the other room. Friends, I said, I've made my decision. I have to make a faith act. I don't know what will happen or what will become of it all, but I don't know where the money, and I don't know where the money will come from, unquote. I turned to Ralph Abernathy, quote, I know you have a need to be in your pulpit on Easter Sunday, Ralph, but I'm asking you to take this faith act with me, unquote. As Ralph stood up unquestionably without hesitation, we all linked hands involuntarily, almost as if there had been some divine signal, and 25 voices in room 30 at the Gaston Motel in Birmingham, Alabama, chanted the battle hymn of our movement, We Shall Overcome. So King decided to go to jail with his followers rather than to raise the money, with the leap of faith that money would come forth at some point for him and his followers, but that he needed to take this act, which he did. And the consequence was the letter from a Birmingham jail. It never would have happened without this act and this major decision in his life. King was arrested, placed in solitary confinement, and while he was in solitary confinement, an African-American jail trustee slipped King a newspaper which contained an ad taken out by 8 white Alabama clergymen of different faiths against King's methods. The letter provoked a response. King later explained how, quote, begun on the margins of the newspaper in which the statement appeared while I was in jail, the letter was continued on scraps of writing paper supplied by a friend and concluded on a pad my attorneys were eventually permitted to leave me, unquote. After 8 days in jail, King was released when president of the UAW, Walter Reuther, arranged a $160,000 bail to bail out King and the other protesters, with the letter having been completed, almost as if that letter was meant to be. Okay, so what was in this amazing letter, begun on April 12th, 1963, in response to this Birmingham News ad taken out by his fellow clergymen? First of all, there's certain buzzwords that the clergyman used that got under his skin. And I'll read a quote from that ad taken out by those 8 Alabama clergymen. Quote, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders. The word outsiders got under his skin. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. Again, those words, unwise and untimely, got under his skin. Quote, later on in the ad, We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham, unquote. Extreme measures being nonviolent sit-ins, protest marches, non-compliance to what King considered immoral laws and ordinances. To call those extreme measures got under his skin and was going to be part of his letter from Birmingham jail. So he sat down in a kind of slow anger at this letter. He responded with one of the most magnificent pieces of writing in the history of American letters. Some of the famous quotes that came from this King's response in the letter from Birmingham jail, many of you know. Quote, in just the early part of the letter, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied to a single garment of destiny, unquote. Magnificent, powerful words that were all interconnected, that we can't separate one injustice from another. There are webs of injustice, and all must be understood that links us with all our fellow human beings. He also went on to say that social analyses could not stick to superficials, that they must grapple with, quote, underlying causes, unquote. So we have to look beneath the surface and see what the underlying causes were. And in doing so, King came up with 4 steps necessary for protest. A was first a collection of facts to determine whether injustices really exist. Not to jump to conclusions. They must be grounded in truth, not exaggeration, groundless assumptions. So research had to start, facts, the truth. B, negotiation. First, social action when it's delayed or positions are ignored or not executed in good faith. C is self-purification. To King, to accept blows without retaliating, turn the other cheek, so to speak. Those famous words from the Sermon on the Mount were key, that all laws needed to be obeyed, all just laws needed to be obeyed conscientiously, so that when there was an unjust law, it could be disobeyed directly and in a focused way. That was part of self-purification. Patriotism had to be behind it. Love of the law in general had to be behind it. But then specific immoral laws had to be opposed and not followed. And 4 was direct action, not violent action, had to be nonviolent, but direct action. He meant nonviolent actions like sit-ins, marches, nonconformity, and civil disobedience to immoral laws. And this comes right out of the Gandhi playbook. Also, that tension is a good thing. The assumption that tension is bad and that we have to stay comfortable and silent was being opposed by King. There comes a time in history that people can't just be silent and ignore important immoral acts that needed to be opposed. He related himself to Socrates, the gadfly of Athens. The gadfly meaning the disturbing fly that would annoy the Athenian community with questions. Socrates went around and asked questions of people's assumptions. That was an annoying gadfly that led them to deeper truths. And this is what Martin Luther King Jr. said was his calling, that he needed to annoy the community, to create tension, so useful tension, good trouble that would lead to important changes. And also the historical fact he brings out, King, in his letter, that privileged groups do not give up their privileges voluntarily, that they must be opposed with nonviolent action. This is one of the reasons why Gandhi and King rejected the phrase passive resistance. Passivity is not what is desired here, that it had to be active steps of nonconformity. And he quoted a famous liberal British 19th century statesman, William Gladstone, justice too long delayed is justice denied. This is an important principle that we can't just keep waiting. which is what this ad that was taken out had asked him and his followers to do. Quote, "The nations of Asia and Africa are moving like jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter," unquote. This is a wonderful metaphor for the slowness of the civil rights movement that King opposes. We must take action now. We can't let injustice to be delayed. He also made a distinction between just laws and unjust laws. How do we know what is an unjust law that needs to be opposed? Just laws square with moral laws and uplift human personality and reinforce human dignity. Unjust laws degrade human beings to the status of things. This is a key distinction, and it gives us a standard by which to evaluate laws and to give us justifications to oppose them or not to oppose them. Just laws square with moral laws and uplift human personality and reinforce human dignity. Unjust laws degrade human beings to the status of things. Very important distinction. Okay. Anyway, these are just some of the key early ideas from the letter from the Birmingham jail. I cannot go to all of them, but I do want to end by one other very important idea that I think is critically important to his thought, and that is to embrace the term extremist rather than to reject it. The the ad that was taken out assumed that extremism was a bad thing. And King points out that Amos in the Bible, Jesus in the New Testament, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson were all extremists, but they were not extremists for hate, but were extremists for love. This is a very important distinction, that it's important that if you're an extremist for love, that's not bad extremism. It's extremism that comes out of hate that is what is bad. And what has to be avoided. And he says that by being extremist, he was following the example of Jesus by opposing the Pharisee hypocrites that he felt were destroying his religion, and he took stand against it. He said, yes, love thy enemy, but not love necessarily what the enemy is doing to themselves and to others. Extremism for love is a good extremism. Anyway, he ends his letter with a vision that is going to be reinforced by a vision that's going to come in his famous I Have a Dream speech. But I want to restate that vision as stated in the letter from a Birmingham jail in April 1963. Quote, "Let us hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty," unquote. This is just a kind of prelude to what he was going to say in perhaps more specific, clearer terms in his I Have a Dream speech. And I'll quote from that. Many of you know this probably by heart, but I will restate it. This is going to be in August of the same year, 1963. He's going to state what that dream actually is. What is that scintillating beauty? One is, I have a dream that one day sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, unquote. Number two, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, unquote. And 3, I have a dream that one day all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, will be able to join hands and to sing in the word of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Thank you very much. And with that, I leave you I hope that you'll read the letter from a Birmingham jail. It is online. It's easy to find. There are 3 or 4 versions of it online. All you need to do is Google Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr., and you can read it. But you could also see King's own reading of his letter from a Birmingham jail, also available online. It's a magnificent piece of history to actually have King himself reading that magnificent letter. And I also advise that you look at the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. and a great book edited by James Washington, I Have a Dream, Writings and Speeches, that he himself, James Washington, edited with a foreword by his wife, Coretta Scott King. So I leave you with that. Thank you all very much. And let's remember King on January 15th, the date of his birthday, but also on the 3rd Monday of January, which will be the official national holiday of Martin Luther King Jr. And remember what a courageous man, what a brilliant thinker and writer he was, and the legacy that he leaves us all as we move forward to keep moving the ball forward in the area of civil rights, in the area of Black Lives Matter, in the area of the vision that King gave us, where all of us can be together as brothers around the same table, rather than separated and segregated and suffering under prejudice. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye now.
Here on the paths of every day, here on the common human way, is all the stuff the gods would take to build a heaven to mold and make new Edens ours, the task sublime, to build eternity in time. We need no other stones to build the temple of the unfulfilled. No other ivy for the doors, no other marble for the floors, no other cedar for the beam and dome of our immortal dream.
An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law.
May the blessings of love rest upon you. May peace abide with you. May God's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore.
Go in peace. Know that you are loved and that your life is sacred.